Hiya, everyone, and welcome to Out of Nowhere. Well, my guest today, John Keeling, wrote a book quite a while ago, about a year ago, Landed. It's about the British, the Great British Flying Saucer hoax and other extraterrestrial spoofs. Some in the UK and some in the States as well. So we're going to have a fascinating subject tonight to talk about. Can we please welcome John to the show? Hello there.
Hi, Bob. Thank you very much to you and your audience for having me.
Thank you very much. For listeners who have not read the book yet, what's the story behind Landed?
Well, it's in the same way they describe football as a game of two halves. It's a book. It's a book of two halves. One half of it looks at all manner of other kind of UFO hoaxes and spoofs, and then the other half concentrates specifically on this incident in Britain in 1967. And it was that incident that got me interested in the notion of spoofing. And I look at it, although I am critical of the UFO movement, let's call it that if you want to.
Yeah.
But it's more the case that the reason I talk about these hoaxes isn't to embarrass people. It's to go, what can we learn from incidents where people thought they had encountered something genuinely extraterrestrial? And so that's really the purpose behind it. And the reason I spent such a long time on the 1967 hoax is that, without any exaggeration, it is the most complex hoax that was ever perpetrated in terms of the fact that it involved so many civil agencies. In the research that I looked into this story, and as a brief recap for anyone of your listeners that's not all perhaps familiar with the story, on one early morning in September 1967, a series of flying saucers, apparently landed flying saucers, were found in a straight line across Britain, all the way from the Kent coast all the way to the west coast, just north of Bristol. So each of those was about 31, 32 miles apart from one another. These flying saucers were they'd fill a tabletop, about 5 feet long, 3 feet wide, couple of feet deep. But the interesting thing about them was that there were no other apparent features on them. They looked like they might be metallic because they were silver and shiny. They were heavy. It took two people to carry one. And for the most of them were also making these very strange kind of electronic bleeping sounds. Now, 1967 was a really big year for flying saucer reports in the UK. I mean, it was absolutely huge. More than 300 reports went to the Ministry of Defence that year, lots of them involving police. So if you were going to pull a prank like this, it was a good time to pull a prank like this. And so consequently, though, over a period of 12 hours, because the first one of these saucers was found, or rather, should I say, the police were alerted to it around about 6 o'clock in the morning. And the last one was opened explosively at 6 o'clock that night. So for 12 hours, the authorities in the UK, for the most part, had absolutely no idea what was going on and absolutely no idea what they were doing. And I've discovered, and this is a modest tally, 47 police officers who were involved in it, multiple RAF personnel, Army bomb disposal personnel, Ministry of Defence personnel, Ministry of Technology personnel, Aviation Ministry personnel. A guy who was involved in the one at that was found at Bromley in Kent. He was working for a specialist branch called C72, and they're more familiar to the public as the Bomb Squad, the Metropolitan Police's Bomb Squad. But as I say, they were called Branch C72, and the man who ran them was a guy called Major Donald Henderson. And he told me he thought after the event that the response would have cost, he said, an astronomical sum. It would have cost thousands upon thousands upon thousands of pounds. The contents of one of the saucers was sent to laboratory Aldermaston, which was a brand new crime forensic lab. I was going to say, beg your pardon, the RAF had to scramble a helicopter for one. As I say, the one of them was explosively opened by Army Bomb Disposal, and so it was a very it was a good hoax in the sense that it sorely tested the authorities. Now, obviously, not every police officer and not every RAF personnel necessarily thought they were dealing with something extraterrestrial that day. A bit like the general public, you had a range of beliefs and a range of views in those personnel. So you would have police officers who were completely skeptical and thought, this is a load of rubbish, it can't be. Or some of the police officers thought, is this something that's fallen off a plane? Some of the police officers thought, God, is this bit of Russian kit? Yeah. And some of the police officers thought, this is extraterrestrial. I mean, there were coppers who were perfectly unashamed to admit to me that they thought it was the real thing, as it were. So you had a range of view across them. But what tends to happen with anything like that is that as you go up the ranks, of the police, the first people involved were usually police constables. Yeah? And then that might be taken over then by either sergeants or, even higher ranks than that, and then or involving plainclothes. Because I know, for instance, that one of these saucers was found on a farm in a farmer's field in Chippenham in Wiltshire. And of course, in Wiltshire, you're very, very, very close to Warminster.
That's right.
As you and your listeners will know, in sort of 1965, 66, 67, Warminster was practically considered UFO central in the UK. It was the kind of flying saucer capital of Britain, if you will. And so it was interesting to me that it meant that the police officers that I spoke to in Wiltshire were more disposed towards considering they might be real than coppers in other part of the country. And so that's a kind of it struck me as interesting. So
when you're talking about that,
go ahead.
How did a group of apprentices manage to fool the police, the military, and the public?
Well, first of all, let's consider the apprentices that did this were first of all, they were engineering apprentices at the Royal Aircraft Establishment in Farnborough.
Ooh, right.
And for people who aren't necessarily familiar with that, if Britain at that time had an equivalent to NASA, it would have been the RAE at Farnborough. All of the high-tech aviation that came out of Britain, things like the Harrier jump jet, Concorde, etc., all of them had their roots in RAE Farnborough. So it was the gold standard in aviation science in the UK. So you can imagine these students had a pretty good and a thorough grounding in all sorts of engineering. And so, but like students being students, every year they would get involved in a rag stunt. And the rag stunt was there to raise charity. I mean, all sorts of colleges and universities in the UK used to do rag stunts. You know, they'd paint zebra crossings across motorways and stuff like that. But in this particular instance, these guys decided that they wanted to stage a flying saucer landing that they thought would be convincing. And so they, as I say, they built their saucers out of fiberglass. But when they were in the process of kind of like planning the job, if you like, there was a lot of worry that where they were going to land these things, literally, some of them might not be found. You know, because some of them were in really kind of like semi-rural spots.
Right.
And so there was a case of, you know, we could go to all this trouble and they won't be found. So what are we going to do about that? And so somebody came up with the idea that the flying saucers should speak. And so one of the hoaxers set about devising a simple electronic oscillating circuit for each of the saucers, and it was decided that each of the saucers would have a different sound. Some of them sounded a bit like a siren, some of them sounded, you know, a real woo, woo, spacey oscillation, you know.
Oh yeah.
But he built this circuit for each of the saucers so that they would each be making a different sound. And that now meant that the saucers had to accommodate a pretty decent sized loudspeaker and fairly substantial battery pack to ensure that there would be power. And then came the next problem, which was that if you want a featureless saucer and you want a power supply in it, by the time that you seal the saucer up, you would set the alarm off, and you would have the battery drained even before you could get anywhere and plant the saucer. Yeah. So they started getting real elaborate then, and that's when they decided that, just like bombers would, they had to come up and devise their own mercury switches. So in the same way that terrorists would detonate a bomb, they had to come up with a mercury switch, which meant that they could seal it inside the saucer with the battery pack. They'd invert the saucer, they would turn it over so that the tube, as it were, the little contact switch with mercury, liquid mercury inside of it, didn't make the contact, and therefore didn't set the alarm off. But when they got to the site that they were going to be planting the saucers, they would turn the saucer over, the circuit would be completed again, as I say, just like bombers would do, and that would set it off. And then what they decided to do to try and make the because obviously they made the things, as I say, they made fiberglass shells, and they didn't want it to look like fiberglass. So they literally went out and bought loads of metal powder. It was powdered aluminium. Now that's a dangerous thing to mess around with, actually, because in fact that's what the solid rocket boosters on a space shuttle or something like that. That's why they were burning.
Oh God!
And so you wouldn't want any mistakes.
No.
And so what they did was, though, they mixed it up with they mixed that aluminium powder up with another coating of resin, of fiberglass resin, and it meant that when that set, they really polished them up. They had drills literally with brushes on the end, covered in cloth, and what it meant was when you buffed it up, it looked like metal. It shone like metal. Yeah. So consequently, some of the people found it, and it was interesting when because bear in mind, all of the people I interviewed about this, I started interviewing them 30 years after the event.
Oh,
so let's not forget. they were talking about their metal. Well, you know, I was only 7 at the time it happened, so I wasn't going to be interviewing anybody there, was I?
No.
And what's interesting is how many people they would go, I think it's metal, and others would go, no, I think it's plastic, and nobody. And we're talking about some real experts being involved here, by the way. Very,
God,
very,
yeah.
and none of them could figure out what the damn things were made of. But there was another thing, there was another factor that that in fact caused the hoaxes some problem. Obviously, having something made of fiberglass like that, even with a battery in and a loudspeaker, it wasn't going to be very heavy. I mean, it wasn't going to be very convincing. You know,
No.
it would be very, very light. You know, so they decided they needed something that would give the sources ballast and weight. You know, but they wanted to be sort of suggestive of something that might be organic. Yeah, that could even be thought of as a life form. Yeah.
Oh, God.
And so they spent ages experimenting, and they thought, should we use gelatin, and should we use this, and should we use that? And they tried all sorts of things. And in the end, they found all they had to do is, if they just boiled up to a high temperature flour and water together, it made a really, really heavy, spongy dough. Yeah. So, you know, it would kind of wobble around. Yeah. And so they filled each saucer with ballast with loads and loads of this dough.
Yeah.
So that, you know, if the saucers were broken into in any way or what have you, it would almost look like brain matter. Yeah.
Clever.
Sort of an off-white, light grey sort of spongy goo. Yeah, but the only thing is, what they really didn't reckon on is, I mean, they're putting a very substantial. I mean, each of those saucers weighed more than 100 weight. Yeah, and remember, they were shiny and slippy as well. It always took 2 people to carry them. But when this stuff was, of course, put in the saucers had to be ready in advance of the event. So doing one at a time, some were finished 2 or 3 weeks before. And what they'd never counted on was that the flour and water would start to ferment.
Oh, yes.
And it did.
Different
And
stages.
it started creating gas inside the saucers. And it started cracking the seal round the edge because it had to escape. So they had to do some hasty repairs and smooth all over the edge again. And what they did this time was they put some pinprick holes just around, strategically, the edge of the rim, so you wouldn't be able to see them if you didn't know they were there.
Right.
But they were allowing the fermented gas to vent. But it was very fortuitous for them in lots of ways, because it also meant that at the different sites, and all sorts of different people remember investigated this. On the one hand, there was this electronic sound coming out, which is, well, what the hell's that? You know, what's causing it? What does it mean? And the other was, some of them said, I could hear a hissing sound.
Yeah.
And of course, that was
that
was those little vents. So, but the fact that something might be venting from this object was, of course, something of concern, because they had no idea. I mean, you know, you could look at the two real doomsday scenarios on this one are, you know, worst possible case. You could start right down one end going, it's a hoax. And then you could work your way up to, is it a drop tank from an aircraft? Is it a weapon from an aircraft? Is it a new piece of, is it something re-entered from outer space that's a piece of Chinese kit, Russian kit, who knows, whoever's kit? But then you get up to the point as well where in that particular instance, they had to seriously consider whether it might be some form of weaponry, in which case you could now be dealing with a potential biological or chemical warfare incident. And then, of course, the very top of the tree, that it might be extraterrestrial. And if it's extraterrestrial and they are venting their environment into yours, and they're venting potential alien microbes into your atmosphere, then you could be in trouble.
Definitely. Yeah, it just makes you wonder then, doesn't it? When they think about that, everybody thinks differently. Like you say, in them days, they didn't know what it was. Or what could it be?
Yeah, I mean, there was a, the interesting thing about it, and why it's got implications for a real, if it should happen for real, what we learned there was that there were multiple different police forces across the country dealing with it. Avon and North Somerset Police dealt with one. Wiltshire Police dealt with another. Berkshire Police dealt with two. The Metropolitan Police dealt with one. Kent Police dealt with one. So all of these different police forces, they all had the same stimulus in front of them. And for hours, none of those police forces realised that any other police force in the country had one as well.
Oh my God. You'd have thought they'd exchanged or got in touch with another police force and said, do you know anything?
Well, in a sense, yes and no, because you've got this thing in your county and you don't know what it is. Well, if you're a police force, you might also think to yourself, God, we don't want to look like a bunch of idiots.
Yes.
I mean, I'm not saying it's that. I'm only saying
I know what you mean.
It's one possible way of viewing it. Now, what happened is that various police forces, therefore, across the country started getting in touch with their first port of call when they deal with something really unusual is to go to Scotland Yard and the Metropolitan Police's, the Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police. That's where their reporting chain goes. And and so what happened, therefore, was that at the Ministry of Defence at Whitehall, an officer in the intelligence department was called in the morning, probably about 10 o'clock, and he was called into his wing commander's office. And he said, Watson, he said, we've got something unusual going on here now. He said, so far we've had at least, he said, 3 reports from police stations of finding landed flying saucers, and that those flying saucers are definitely there on the ground now. And Watson sat there, and I asked
Dr. Watson.
I asked him, Cliff Watson, actually, bless him.
Right.
I'll come back to a story about Cliff Watson, actually. Very, 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 very bright guy. You didn't do. He was a specialist in radar technology at the time,
Right.
and but part of his brief was also to investigate any UFOs that the Air Ministry handed on to him, and so I asked him, and I'm going to say one relatively gentle swear word now. Okay, I'm warning your listeners. Okay, and I said to him, I said, tell me, I said, at that point in time when your wing commander, who was called Sidney Munns, was in front of you, and he said to you this had happened and that they were on the ground and that they were definitely there. I said, what did you think? And he said, I thought, shit, what are we going to do now?
I bet it did as well.
Which I thought was rather, it was candid of him to be be that honest about it. And indeed, as I say, what ensued afterwards was was absolute chaos. It was complete and utter chaos. I mean, police forces I can think of at least 3 sites where the police force decided in their wisdom to pick up this unusual object, drive it through built up towns and take it to a police station.
No.
Now, given that you don't know, even if you don't think that this is an extraterrestrial artifact, something from it could be something very dangerous. You simply don't know what it is. So would you put it in the back of the police car and drive it into a built up area and take it into a police station?
No,
I mean,
you wouldn't.
You wouldn't, would you? But that's exactly what happened. Now, it had in one instance, it had some real consequences, that one, because when the one that was found on the golf course at Bromley, in the end, the senior officer, I beg your pardon, at Bromley Police Station, Superintendent Shepherd, he was in radio contact with the officers who were on the golf course and who'd found it. By then, there were about 3 police vehicles and 4 police officers surrounding this little flying saucer on the first green of the first fairway, and so he basically said, well, he said, bring it in. You can bring it in. So the senior police officer gave. Now, later that day, as I say, Scotland Yard forensics were contacted by Bromley Police Station, and so the call was put through to a gentleman called Detective Superintendent Ernest Barnett, and he was the forensics team had a nickname called the Dirty Knickers Branch, for perhaps some fairly unpleasant but obvious reasons.
Yes,
and he picked the phone up in the middle of the morning, and the voice on the other end said, "This is Bromley Nick here. We need you guys down at the station because we found a landed flying saucer." And Barnett said, "Don't be bloody silly," and he put the phone down. He literally just put the phone down on them. He didn't think any more about it. And about half an hour later, he got a phone call from a police station in Berkshire, and they said, "Look, we've got this landed flying saucer in a field, and you know, do you guys want to come out and see it?" And he's thinking to himself, right, this is a bit odd. And he puts the phone down, and no sooner than he did, the phone went again, and it was Berkshire police again, but a different saucer. And they said, the RAF have just tried to winch this one up, and it sprayed them with something that smells really bad, and we're a bit worried. And we're a bit worried about germ warfare. So Barnett then immediately got back on the phone to Bromley Police Station, because Bromley was the nearest police station to him, being in central London. He was near Holborn, and so he got onto them, and he said, "Look," he said, "this flying saucer at the golf course," he said, "just tell us precisely where it is, please. We're going to come out." And he said, "Oh, you don't need to worry." He said, "We brought it to the police station." And
I bet he wasn't happy.
He was very unhappy, and I can't repeat many of the things that he said on your show. So he went then, and he got 2 of the officers from C72 branch I described earlier, who were both ex-army sappers. Yes, so they knew how to defuse explosives.
Oh yeah.
And so these 3 plainclothes guys all got in a car and went straight down to Bromley Police Station. Now, when they got to Bromley Police Station, they drove into the backyard. They got out of the vehicle, and when they did, they could see that there were loads of coppers all milling around it. There were people laughing and joking. There were office ladies hanging out of the windows. Somebody had made pipe cleaner little men and stuck them on top of the saucer. They were all having a right. And Barnett and the bomb disposal officers went ballistic. They went absolutely. The air was turned blue by them, and they spoke the same way to, in fact, the senior police officer there. And as I say, I can't use the language, but it was get this beeping yard clear. I want these people out. I want that gone. Nobody should have been it. And they tore them off a real strip, because it really could have been anything, couldn't it?
Of course it could have been.
Not least of all, which was still an alien artifact.
Yeah.
So as I say, it was a very profound, I think, alert in its scale and its size, and so in the book I kind of go through it logically, if you like, the mistakes that were undoubtedly made, but also looking at it, I try and come up in there with a kind of how you could do this differently. Yeah. How you could do it if you approached it as just in case, just in case this could be real. Yeah. Then why not follow it this way? And I was able to use, there was some good stuff I found in the Defence Archives down at Kew, and one of which was a document from the 1970s when there'd been concern about a satellite re-entry. Now, this satellite re-entry, the satellite itself was a very substantial one in size. It was a Russian one, but it also had a small kind of like a nuclear power plant on board it. So there was a contamination risk. And at one point, there was fears that it might deorbit over the UK and come down. And so if it did, this protocol therefore deals with what do we do if an unusual spaceborne object comes down that could be threatening.
Yeah.
And so it serves as a very useful. So I use that as a kind of guide, and where they talked about satellite debris, I simply swapped it for extraterrestrial vehicle, and it works fairly well. I mean,
Hey, John, just a minute. What happens to the students?
Yeah, good one. So it was very interesting. Once again, in the same way that police forces across the country reacted very differently to each other over it. Some didn't take it seriously. Some took it very seriously. Some coped with it very well. Some coped with it very badly. So there was a lot of coppers who were embarrassed and are rather stung by the experience.
Yeah.
And they were all for prosecuting the students, and they really wanted to. They were kind of like,
I bet they did.
We want to nick them for this, and we want to nick them for that. We want to nick them for littering, all this kind of stuff. And
John, what would happen if it was today?
Today it would be different, and the reason it would be different today is because, one, the level of CCTV coverage around the country is such that the idea that you could even pull off such an elaborate ruse completely undetected, I think is fairly slender, to be honest with you. And the other thing as well is, bear in mind, the media at that time, you would have a TV news report at lunchtime, and then you would have a TV news report at 6 o'clock. That was it.
Yeah.
So it wasn't. Now everything's covered. All of the, nothing's switched off forever. people have got. I mean, think if people had had mobile phones then, they've got them now. I don't think you could pull off a hoax like this today. But then you could and did, to spectacular success. But going back to your point, I'd like to finish the point you asked me about, which
Yes,
was
please.
getting in trouble with the police.
Yeah.
The Scotland Yard guy I was talking about a short while ago, Detective Ernest Barnett, 2 days after the hoax, he was called into the offices of the Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police, who is the most senior police officer in the country. He goes into his office. Right, Barnett, he said, I hear you've been having problems with flying saucers. So Barnett effectively relayed the story of the Bromley one and what he'd learned about the others. And so the commissioner's got all these newspapers, because it was massive media coverage. I mean, the newspapers, they were full of it. I mean, full front pages. They were for days and days and days. They were full of it. And so there's all these things there about the police wanting to prosecute and that and whatever. And he said, I can see here. He said that there are lots of people very upset in the force about this, and Barnett was too. And so then he just looked at him and he said he looked at me for a moment and he went very quiet and he said, Mr. Barnett, he said, there will be no prosecutions.
Oh, brilliant.
And that was it. Now,
finished.
He didn't elaborate on that, but Barnett had got the most senior police officer's word in the country. That was good enough for him, as far as I can. My view is that Simpson, who was the chief commissioner, he wasn't a senior cop for nothing. He was a very sensible bloke. If this had gone to court, and all of the evidence about how badly it had been mismanaged by the authorities had come to light, which any defense barrister would have
ripped into them.
How good would that have looked? Now, that's only my theory. Yeah, I've got no evidence to back that up.
But it's true, that, isn't it?
Well, it wouldn't have looked good, would it?
No. Oh, no. They look stupid. They got thrown out of court.
And in the end, if you think about it, honestly, depositing litter was probably the closest they could have got to anything. They might have been able to try and go for something like an act of public mischief. But here's the problem. For it to be an act of public mischief, you'd have to believe they were alien, wouldn't you?
Yes.
And since nobody at that time was saying we're officially being visited by aliens, then how could something that simply had a saucer-like shape be considered mischief?
True. I bet they were laughing their heads off. The students.
Well. For
what happened to them?
They eventually did, but for a day or so after they'd been discovered, they thought they might get in really, really big trouble. I mean, they were certainly worried they were, and in fact, they did get called in to see the director of the Royal Aircraft Establishment. And that director, and you know what? I'll be honest with you, without plowing through the book now, I'm afraid his name literally escapes my memory.
That's okay.
But nonetheless, and I've just remembered Sir Robert Coburn. So Sir Robert Coburn, during the Second World War, when the invasion of D-Day was going to take place, Sir Robert Coburn was one of the principal architects of all of the electronic deception that fooled the Germans. So they were doing things like sending out bogus radio traffic from army units that didn't exist. And he was involved in sending over squadrons of aircraft who were dropping metal chaff in waves so that they would look like they were ships on radar.
Oh,
and
yeah.
so he was involved in really a massive electronic deception. It was what
Clever
he was
man.
knighted. It was what he was knighted for. He was so no wonder he was the director of the Royal Aircraft Establishment. So he got these guys in there, the hoaxers, and he said, right. He said, can you tell me? He said, can you assure me that none of the items inside those saucers were properties of the RAE? And they said, absolutely, they weren't. We went out and bought them, blah, 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 blah. And he said, okay. He said, you've put a lot of people to a lot of trouble. Well done.
Wonderful.
I mean, after all, if you're teaching people to think out of the box,
Yeah,
and you're giving them technical skills, then actually I would have said that his apprentices had done an absolutely brilliant job.
oh my God, yeah. Well, you would, wouldn't you?
And after all, he'd fooled people with an invasion, and they just didn't fool people with an invasion.
Yeah, exactly. Absolutely brilliant story, that one, isn't it? Can we have a look at the 1974 slag pond?
Sure.
Yeah. Carnival.
Or the thing from the Black Lagoon, as I call it.
Yes.
This was now this is of an entirely different nature, and it also shows you, this one really shows you how something so simple can get so out of control. So 1974, Carbondale in Pennsylvania, not far from a big coal slag heap and what have you, there was about 4.5 acre pond. At its deepest, it was about 10 feet deep. And it was very dark because there was lots of coal slag in there.
Yeah.
Anyway, a couple of teenage boys said to the police, we saw this funny light come over. And so they said, oh, really? So they decided to go and take a look. And when they went to the pond, they could see down somewhere in the depths of the pond, there was a light shining up. It's coming up from the depth of the pond. And none of them knew what it was. And there'd been UFO reports around of late. And so the police chief decided at that point in time that you better get somebody just to do a rudimentary investigation. So they borrowed a rowing boat and they rowed out. And one of the coppers, there were 2 coppers in this boat, 2 American policemen, obviously. One of them's got literally a great big stick, and he's trying to he's shoving it in the water to see if he can find out what this light is,
Yeah.
But the light appeared to move, and at that point, the other officer drew his gun and discharged it. Started firing down at this light, which tends to suggest that there was a bit of nervousness going on about this light thing. Anyway, it started escalating, and the police chief at that point in time in 1974, the United States Air Force were out of the UFO game. Project Blue Book had been closed down in 1969 after the Condon report.
Yeah.
And so by the early 1970s, the advice to police officers and police stations in the US was to contact J. Allen Hynek's Center for UFO Studies, QFOS, as they were called. And so the police chief, who was a guy called Dottle, he was the acting police chief at that point in time. He got in touch with Hynek's crew, and of course reports started getting out there that something unusual had landed at night in this pond.
Yeah.
And and it was still underwater, and it was still there, and nobody knew what it was. And then there were rumors around now that the police have been opening fire on it. Anyway, now by the next morning, of course, people are hearing all these fragments of radio reports, and they're turning up in their droves. I mean, thousands of people are descending on it. I mean, it was between minimum 1,500 to 3,000 additional people turned up, but some estimated even more than that. So and they were having to call in everybody. They were having to call in National Guardsmen. They even called in Boy Scouts to help rope things off, so at least 2 different UFO groups turned up. One guy from QFOS, one from another UFO group whose acronym I can't remember now. And both of those guys had brought Geiger counters with them as well. And they were trying to and they were taking low readings off the pond. And anyway, on and on the saga went. So, you know, somebody decides that the only way that they're going to get to this thing is they are literally going to dig a channel out of the pond and drain water out of it.
Oh God.
And that's exactly what they started doing. They drained it. So they've got this channel now. And then maybe about 14 hours in or so, the light went out. Yeah. The light had gone out. And now it was kind of, what's happened? So there's now a big crowd control problem. If there's any kind of genuine emergency, there aren't enough police in Carbondale to cope with whatever a genuine emergency. If there'd been a house fire or something like that, they'd have really been in trouble.
Oh God, yeah.
And so this incident went on for more than 40 hours.
Oh,
and early on in it, 2 guys turned up who claimed to be scuba divers with their gear, and one of them said, "Look, I'll tell you what, I'll take a dive in. I'll go and take a look for you," and everything like that. But the only problem was he was on parole in another state, and he said, "Oh no, you couldn't make it up, could you? I'll need your permission." Anyway, the Dottle who was in charge was starting to get a bit exasperated and a bit fed up of it all, because it was Carbondale had become utterly overwhelmed by it all, completely overwhelmed by it. And they're hours and hours and hours into it, and nobody's made any progress yet. And so they tie ropes to one of the scuba divers, and they said, "Right, you can dive in, but we've got the means to pull you out as a safety measure if we need to." Yeah.
Oh.
And bear in mind, by this time they've got newsreel helicopters flying around it and everything like that. And if you can imagine, I made an analogy in the book. You know the scene originally in Jaws where everybody turns up to try and catch the shark, and the police are overwhelmed by everybody out. Well, think that for this great big pond, yeah, that's got now a UFO in it, they think.
Yeah.
Anyway, so the scuba diver goes around for about 10 minutes ago, comes up. No, can't see anything yet. It's going to go back down. Comes up again 2 minutes later with a miner's lamp. A miner's lamp. So the aliens have landed, yeah, where somebody had thrown a miner's lamp, the battery pack, into the pond. But, and I think I want to make, and one of the reasons it's in there, first of all, is just to show you how events can get completely carried away, completely out of control.
Yeah.
You know, a lot of people in the UFO community have always said the reason that there's the so-called conspiracy of silence that they believe in, the reason there's a conspiracy that the public can't be told the truth, is because they'd panic. Now, how interesting that in the two incidents here that I've been talking about, you couldn't keep the public away.
No, you couldn't.
They flocked there in their hundreds and indeed thousands. So, you know what? That doesn't really bear out the conspiracy theory, does it?
Does it? To say if aliens landed, they're going to run away.
So, and there are lots of instances in this book as well, sort of similar things, different levels of responses and what have you, that goes to show you that the complete opposite happens. And in fact, if you say aliens, people go, where?
They absolutely do. It's true what you're saying there, because I go to a place at Benton and it's a bird sanctuary. There's been lots of UFO sightings up there, and they come from miles around.
Absolutely. But here's an interesting thing. And I make the point in there. UFO, let's call it, on the one hand, you can say UFO enthusiasts. On the other, you can say ufologists. After all, you can join Bufora or you can join MUFON or what have you, and you can get your little investigator's kit and you can get your little ID badge. And now you do a little course, a little correspondence course, and now you're a ufologist. But the interesting thing is, people used to turn up in this country and still do to sky watches. Yeah, I mean, certainly at this time, sky watches were a really big deal, and people would turn up in their hundreds, both in America and both in the UK. And if you think about it, these people turned up to what could be, in fact, a really, really serious event. I mean, after all, if an extraterrestrial vehicle actually landed in front of you, and it could be giving off any form of kind of radiation, there could be a biological hazard associated. There's all manner of things without even any form of hostile intent on the part of an extraterrestrial artifact, which means the idea that going out on a UFO watch for a laugh with your mates and taking a couple of cans with you, which is the way it's described, by the way, in a lot of the literature, think about that for a moment. I don't think UFO groups make themselves look that credible. They certainly didn't at the time that we're talking about here.
No.
Because if you think something like this is going to genuinely happen, you really need to have your wits about you, don't you? I mean, in the book, I also touch upon a situation where in the late 60s and the early 1970s, UFO groups started spoofing one another to see how credulous these different groups were. And so Warminster was obviously one place that was favourite from that. And so they came up with some very, very ingenious hoaxes, things like they would inflate balloons and then put timers on them that would fire off camera flash bulbs. So there would be suddenly a mad pattern of brilliant lights, and then it would be, and they spent, and boy, oh boy, they did fool each other, and it caused all sorts of bad blood. Certainly in the UFO community at that time, and it was considered to be grossly irresponsible, etc., etc. But here's the truth of the matter. What it goes to show is that if you're going to seriously and credibly investigate something which you're arguing might be extraterrestrial, then the fact of the matter is you've got to do it in a really smart, adult, mature way. And it isn't just a lark.
Well, I totally agree what you say there. It ain't a laugh. You've got to be cautious. You just don't know what radiation could finish up dying from it.
I mean, that said, and you and I have spoken before, Bob. And I hate to be a disappointment to perhaps some of your listeners, but My own view is that I am not all convinced by UFO evidence, that UFOs represent, an extraterrestrial visitation. I'd need much, much better evidence than I see. But that also doesn't mean that I think that we're alone in the universe. I think that the idea that there might be extraterrestrial intelligence out there is a perfectly reasonable and a perfectly credible view. I also don't think there's anything wrong with the idea of extraterrestrials actually sending, probes this way. But the idea that we repeatedly visited all the time by umpteen different biological species, I just can't buy into it, because the problem with that is it would have to make the Earth somehow really special. Well, if there's all these other life forms everywhere, and if there's all these other planets that habited elsewhere, what on earth could be special about the Earth?
Well, you've got a point there as well.
I just, I could imagine, with the age of stars in our own galaxy, the first stars that could have ever given birth, as it were, to planets that could have hosted life was about 3 billion years after the Big Bang. And if you gave them the same timeline to develop as we had, it would mean that round about 5 to 6 billion years before humanity would have been the first possibility of other intelligent species being elsewhere in our galaxy. And some of them, I could perfectly imagine a situation where they would go, right, well, send probes out, self-replicating probes. You send a probe to that solar system over there. When it arrives in that solar system, using artificial intelligence, it builds a copy of itself and it sends that off over there. And you start building up, without any astronauts, simply a relay station of going, that's an interesting target star over there. That's an interesting target star over there. And you could have a situation where you could have a communication channel between these artificial intelligences that don't, nobody in their right mind is going to keep tooling around at the speed of light with the effects of relativity. Because the fact of the matter is, you leave your loved ones behind, you go off for 8 years, 4 light years there, 4 light years back, you get back and everybody you love is dead and gone. Yeah, I don't buy into it. We're already starting to learn the capabilities of artificial intelligence on this planet. Well,
Yeah.
trust me, other species out there would have hearkened onto it as well. And in truth, the first any kind of emissary that we will ever find from another extraterrestrial civilization, the closest we're ever going to find to it will be some form of AI probe. I'm absolutely certain of it. It won't be a biological creature. Biological creatures are far too fallible,
Well, there
particularly
you go.
for deep space flight. Anyway, we must be there now, Bob, surely.
We're about nearly there. Finally, what are you working on next? And can you give our listeners a exclusive teaser?
Well, I'd love to be able to say I could, but in fact, the book I'm working on at the moment is an entirely different subject.
Totally different.
It's got honestly, it's got nothing to do with extraterrestrials or aliens and stuff like that. But that subject is one I definitely want to revisit it, and with a slightly different take on it. Briefly before we go, I think Donald Trump is dangerously delusional, and I've often wondered about, can you imagine if we had a SETI detection now, or even a direct visitation from an extraterrestrial, and he would be in charge? My God. Can you imagine him being in charge of a
Crackers.
situation like that? So I'm going to write a book, I think, that will touch upon that as a subject.
Well, it'd be a brilliant subject to write about. That's for sure.
Okay, Bob.
Well, thank you, John, for coming on the show. Very
You're welcome.
interesting subject. I've enjoyed that tonight.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you for having me. And as I say, I hope that the your audience who are believers in UFOs will forgive me for my skepticism.
That's all right. I know John Allen's just got into chat room, and he's from the east coast of Australia. I'm up early this morning. It's now coming up to 6 o'clock in the morning for him tomorrow morning.
Okay then, Bob.
No, thank you. Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure as always. My guest next Wednesday is
Thank you.
Ronnie Kinsella. Great guy, Ronnie is. He's a twin of Philip. They write books on UFOs, write books on lots of different subjects as well. Oh. Thank you to everybody in the chat room. Thank you to my guest as well. Bye for now.